Have you ever played a game that, within its particular franchise fandom, is viewed as this odd black sheep that nobody likes talking about, and when they do, it's only to denigrate it? And then, when you leave that particular fandom space and talk to the wider world, suddenly it's one of the highlights of 2009, and a fantastic and respected game? This video is about such a game, aka Resident Evil 5, a game that exists in the context of all that came before it, and created context that affected games after it. It stands as a particular lightning rod in the fan spaces surrounding Resident Evil, and a major turning point in its history. It was the best-selling Resident Evil game for quite a long time up until the remake of Resident Evil 2, and has still sold more copies overall as of the writing of this video. The way people talk about this game even today shocks me, and it's a tender reminder that gamers as people will not ever let anything go. But why did Resident Evil fans hate Resident Evil 5? And is some of that derision warranted? Let's dive into some history. So, if you are someone who is squeamish, or scares easily, or otherwise has reason to be completely unfamiliar with the horror genre, there is a specific trend that affects the genre that tends to make fans, no matter the franchise, rather annoyed. As long as there's been action movies, horror movies that become series have had a tendency to slowly slide into an actionized and much less scary version of themselves. It goes as far back as the 80s and likely before that too. Terminator was a franchise that started out pure horror, even with the guns involved, but by the time of the third film was already becoming an actionized parody of itself. The Alien and Predator franchises went through this too, especially when they crossed over, which created such reviled video games as Alien and Colonial Marines. This stigma against horror turning into action meant that when Resident Evil 4 came around, a lot of Resident Evil fans were wary and some were even upset. Sure, today Resident Evil 4 is remembered as a gaming gem and an icon that changed and influenced two whole generations of gaming. However, it also had a campy, tongue-in-cheek action influence that, while it didn't prevent the game from being a terrifying horror entry, also differed noticeably from the more muted horror entries that came before. Whether or not you think that Resident Evil 4 did the right thing by including more action doesn't change the fact that Resident Evil 4 was necessary. I'll be bringing this up later because history does have a tendency to repeat itself, but Resident Evil simply needed a change at that point. Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil Code Veronica had all been done in the same style, which means they'd all been done basically to death. Everyone knew the formula at that point: dark scary castles, underground labs, viruses that create zombies, etc. Resident Evil 4 was a breath of fresh air. It changed up the pacing, the gunplay, the gaming interface, the tone, the direction, and in a stroke of brilliance it said something bold. Resident Evil doesn't have to be zombies. Las Plagas, a deadly and mutated parasite, became the new star of the show, opening up a whole new world of sick and nightmarish body horror for Resident Evil to explore. It was a good thing, so most people accepted it and got over it. However, Resident Evil 4 in 2005 was followed by Resident Evil 5 in 2009. Resident Evil 5 took a long time to create, and you can tell because it's a very polished game, but it's an action game, ditching the horror angle almost entirely to focus on gunplay, explosions, and a sense of badassery. It pissed a lot of people off because it made a lot of moves that horror fans, and especially Resident Evil fans, viewed as selling out, chasing that Call of Duty coin that was so prevalent at the time, and abandoning its core audience. What I need to make clear here is that this really isn't what Resident Evil 5 did. Resident Evil as a franchise had always had action movie-esque elements and a lot of camp. These elements weren't newly introduced in 4, they'd been present the whole time, only now they were receiving more prominence. I feel like I need to double down on this since a lot of people live in delusion when it comes to this fact, so let me throw out a reminder. There's a grenade launcher in almost every game, and the first game alone has you dodging giant boulders and going 1v1 with giant spiders while armed with a flamethrower. Not to mention that game is the origin point of the traditional blast the final boss to smithereens with a rocket launcher sequence. This in particular is why I'm very keen to defend and uplift Resident Evil 5, and why I'm not as forgiving towards later entries, which went back to the horror atmosphere of Resident Evil, but did so by adopting a style and mechanics that in my opinion were very much someone else's homework. At least when Resident Evils 4, 5, and 6 are actionized, they're still being honest Resident Evil games, and not trying to grab the Outlast audience, but I'll get into that subject in a different video. There is quite a lot of Resident Evil 5 that bears the mark of 2009 gaming, such as the co-op angle, which was a demonic plague invading damn near every gaming franchise to an extremely unwelcome degree back then, and for some 10 years after. Or the fact that it's chock full of QTEs that basically exist to be playable cutscenes. But to be fair, it ages much, much better than most other games similarly plagued by these things, and in fact a lot better than most Resident Evil games. You can look back on these things with the context of the current gaming era and admit this if you're not completely boneheaded, And to be quite honest, I'd rather have a co-op game I can play in single player and a lot of QTEs and a fast-paced action romp than play one more walking simulator trying to be deep but not equipped with much in the way of good drama. To really get into why people hated Resident Evil 5 and still hate it when it should be going through a renaissance if anything, you kind of have to go back to 2009 and see what was going on, not to mention the meat of the game itself. The initial trailers for Resident Evil 5 turned a lot of people off. Chris was suddenly this muscle-bound badass when his last look had been fairly average, and he was depicted as a lone hero gunning down savage black people in Africa. This is far from the first time Capcom has displayed a measure of cultural insensitivity, and so this was quickly rectified by adding in Sheva Alomar, a partner for Chris to take on his adventure through Africa, and quite noticeably a black woman. Sheva, of course, features as an AI partner in a solo campaign, and a place for a co-op partner to plug into via online play. In truth, these elements were probably being planned for Resident Evil 5 in some fashion a little earlier than just the racism scandal, since it was admittedly all the rage at the time. This ended up putting Resident Evil 5 in a really awkward space, especially with hindsight. Co-op was, as I say, a goddamn plague on the gaming industry at the time, right up there with stamina meters. But it's especially poisonous to horror gaming, when horror thrives off of isolation. Having a voice and a capable partner present to help and guide you inherently lowers the dread of any horror experience. Of course, given the way horror games would turn out later, maybe we can say that Resident Evil 5 and 6 were simply too early to the party in this respect, since games like Dead by Daylight and Friday the 13th would focus almost entirely on cooperative play and are quite well liked by horror fans. Resident Evil 5 went on to become Capcom's best-selling game of all time for quite a while thereafter, which is how it got to be one of the most respected games of that era among casual players. But I think a lot of Resident Evil fans took this as betrayal and a sign they were never going to be welcome in their own fanbase again, with Resident Evil slipping out of their grasp forever. I relate to that fear on some level. It's kind of what I'm dealing with for more than one franchise, not just this one, for a multitude of reasons. I do admittedly think a lot of these fears were overblown though. A good 75% of Resident Evil 5 is an action game, but every once in a while it decides to be a horror game, and when it does, it's quite effective, to the point that it becomes jarring. The Ouroboros segment early on, or the liquor hallways, or anything to do with the Reapers stands out as some of Resident Evil's most dread-inducing sequences. Not to mention there was an entire DLC called Lost in Nightmares that focused on Chris and Jill, where co-op absolutely doesn't stop it from being hideously effective in terms of scares, and possessed of a sinister and unnerving atmosphere throughout. I can barely even play it. Capcom hadn't abandoned their main audience at this time. However, a lot of people just don't take apologies for this sort of thing, and with the advent of 2014 yet to occur, a lot of people feared losing the Resident Evil they knew forever, and that grudge against this game has lingered ever since. It's a shame because this is a fantastic game and a great Resident Evil game, albeit not flawless. Resident Evil 5 does turn me off in its fair share of ways, although not nearly as much as other entries in the series. I'm a believer in being fair about both positives and negatives, and it would be disingenuous to suggest that Resident Evil 5 doesn't have some of both. My main sticking point is that the particular issues I take with Resident Evil 5 bear pretty much no resemblance to what I hear people endlessly complain about, which means either I'm crazy, or I'm smarter than the average gamer, or possibly both. Curiously, one of the issues that plagues this game that doesn't get talked about outside the context of the initial trailers, and the scandal they caused, is the racism. Yeah, Chris is being escorted through Africa by Sheva, and there's far more than just black people being gunned down. However, any claim to cultural sensitivity gets undone by Chapter 3, where the enemies for the next two chapters all consist of savage natives in mud huts, and the game plays them up as spear-wielding, swamp-dwelling tribals devoid of reason or modernity. There's a half-assed file hidden in one of those mud huts that pays lip service to how the African natives weren't originally like this, but it's not really enough to save these chapters where I'm gunning down crazed primitives while stealing all their gold and precious gems. It all just feels uncomfortable. Also, the plot of Resident Evil 5, and in the process the characters, all kind of suck. The main deal is that while the Las Plagas outbreak is happening among the African metropolitan area of Kijuju, Wesker is flitting around in the shadows with the blessing of a big megacorp called Tricell, using their resources to develop and spread a world-ending virus, all while Chris is in search for his partner Jill, who is another series mainstay who was established as having died, that is to say gone missing, 3 years earlier. It's this last part that makes the plot feel really weak throughout a lot of it. A lot of this game's story really only exists to give Chris, a single man, a woman to desperately chase after. The Chris and Jill relationship had existed among fans and been alluded to in certain games prior, but it's only here that it dominates the game so thoroughly, to the point Chris starts sounding like a broken record.
Jill, You're like a broken record, you know that?
Of course, Jill turns out to be alive, though in a cruelly dull twist, she's been brainwashed by Wesker and Chris has to fight against her. This doesn't even make sense on Wesker's part, given that he hates the both of them, and given everything about his character before this point, any action towards Jill deemed in character on his part would have involved killing her the second he got the chance. Of course, that's far from the only stupid thing Wesker does in this game. This is Albert Wesker's final game, and the one where he finally bites it. I don't really mind that on its own. Wesker and his mysterious ultimate goals were never going to be able to live up to the endless hype fans had given him previously, so I'm just glad he got to go out in style. I don't even mind that he ended up being some omnicidal maniac who feels the need to infect everyone on the planet with a virus just to feel superior to them. What I do mind is the absolute blockheadedness of this plan, given that Wesker, who is supposed to be this super smart virologist, is going ahead with it, in spite of the fact that there's literally no proof Ouroboros even does what he says it does. He and his partner Excella build up this Ouroboros virus as some kind of ultimate advancement tool, mutating the chosen ones into a new superior kind of human, while killing the unworthy. Mind you, literally every time this virus is used on someone, it just turns them into a tentacle monster, including Wesker himself. You may be wondering where Las Plagas intersects with all of this, and to be honest, it kind of doesn't. Las Plagas remains this Tricell thing with no ultimate goal, and Excella, Tricell's main face in the game, only ever talks up Ouroboros, with no clear reasoning behind why the civilians in Kijiji were infested with parasites in one of the worst bioterror incidents ever, and generally being focused on Wesker's stuff. And this is where Resident Evil 5 really seals its own fate. Its core problem is that it tries to do two things at once, when it would benefit much better from doing only one thing. The Las Plagas plot has little to do with Sheva, the newcomer, or Wesker, the old face and big bad villain. The reality of Resident Evil 5 is that it should have been two games. Now, while I've seen a lot of people propose this idea, what I do not agree with is the prominent idea that Sheva should have been axed and that Resident Evil 5 should have focused solely on Chris and Jill. Did you guys know that Sheva Alamar's file in the Resi 5 library is 36 goddamn pages long? It is the second longest file in the game, second only to, get this, the History of Resident Evil file. In it, it goes into how Sheva's life was destroyed as a child by Umbrella twice over, and how she ended up a child soldier and a desperately poor individual who only knew how to fight. Yeah, it does hit some racism bumps with its airs of privileged white man brings black girl to America so she can see what real living is like, but it does make it clear that Sheva is an exceptional person, learning English at a native level within 6 months, graduating university with high honors, and going on to become a fighter in the BSAA who would eventually save the world. You want girl power? Sheva's got it. You want black excellence? Sheva's got it. A poor black immigrant from the middle of nowhere Africa who eventually stops the bioterror in the region and does half the work killing off Albert Wesker himself. Sheva is amazing. And while I think Wesker himself should have been reserved for Chris and Jill, I do think Sheva should have been allowed to lead her own game. She has all that it takes to be a great mainstay for Resident Evil. She's a capable, likable badass with an air of tragedy that doesn't keep her down or distract her from fighting the good fight. Who the hell dislikes Sheva Alamar? She even comes packaged with her own personal antagonist in the form of Excella Gione, who, much like Sheva herself, had her potential wasted in favor of attaching her to a man whose stakes in the game overshadowed her own. Excella Gione, who also has her own file by the way, highlighting how Excella was rich and privileged and yet still not satisfied, she has what it takes too. She's this wealthy European woman with everything she could possibly want, yet still spends her time in her career being ruthlessly cruel to innocent people in underdeveloped nations, all to serve her own finances and ego. Pit her against the good-natured and positive yet righteously angry Sheva Alamar, who comes from the bottom rung of the ladder and fights for those innocents, and you're really cooking. Las Plagas could have been the sole bioweapon threatening Africa at the hands of Excella, who could have blossomed into Sheva's personal nemesis the way Wesker did for Chris. But with all that said, if we take what Resident Evil 5 still gave us, it's still very much a worthwhile experience. Resident Evil 5's main strength lies in its approach to being an action game. Yeah, there's been camp and cheese and explosions in other Resi games, but 5 is this gloriously over-the-top 80s action movie romp. There's bullets and explosions everywhere, the villains are funny and campy and fun to hate, the women are all really hot and kick-ass, the men are all buff and sweaty, the gunplay and vehicle sequences are amazing and intense, and every once in a while there's a slow-motion scene that really knocks you on your ass. It's so cool. There's even a giant laser you can fire.
There it is! Fire!
All of this is accented by truly gorgeous visuals. Resident Evil 5 has that intense stylization that came with video game graphics truly advancing. The color palette is amazing, the texturing and lighting all work really well, and the motion capture and modeling work, not to mention the dubbing, are all extremely well done and polished. I see cutscenes in this game and I'm still floored by how good they look. The audio design is top-notch too. All the sounds from the guns are distinct and recognizable, and they pack a nice punch.
How you so loud?
And the characters grunting or yelling when they're hit or landing a melee attack still has that oomph that I like. Of course, what made Resident Evil 5 so acclaimed with people who didn't have a chip on their shoulder is the gameplay, which is easily its strongest suit. Resident Evil 5 focuses on gunplay while fending off hordes of parasite infestees or monsters, aiming for weak points, running from threats that are too dangerous, and combining herbs to heal on the go while managing inventory, all of which is customary for Resident Evil, yet streamlined here. The attaché case from Resident Evil 4 has been swapped out for a simpler inventory square that has 9 slots, 18 if you count Sheva helping to carry things, and has to be managed in-game without pausing, thus becoming its own little skill set that's worth mastering since managing inventory in the heat of battle is crucial to surviving. Along the way, you can use money and treasures that are worth a lot of cash to upgrade your weapons, which will also be vital to fending off the growing threats. And if you ever find yourself low on ammo, you can make up the difference by staggering enemies with a good shot to the head or to a limb, which will open them up to a melee counterattack which differs for each playable character, yet can always be relied on to make you feel like a badass. Along the way, you'll get to see the varied locales of the nearby landscape, from Kichiju's disrepaired slums to the African savanna, from the wetlands and the caves to the underground ruins of ancient native kingdoms, all the way to the biolabs being used to create organic weapons. The gameplay is given a third dimension by the presence of the AI partner, who on the first playthrough is always Sheva, which leads us into the one point that people who play Resident Evil 5 tend to feel certain ways on. Sheva has her own health bar and can die, as well as assist in combat with her own weapons and melee attacks. Resident Evil 5's racism accusations notwithstanding, which is weird because Resident Evil 5 is flagrantly racist, this left Sheva with a lot of accusations of bad and frustrating AI that colored the rest of the game. This, however, is one that I'll be putting my foot down on. If, in the year of our Lord 2025, you're calling the Sheva AI partner bad or poorly designed, you might just not be that good at the game. A lot of people look back on Sheva as this frustrating ball and chain of a partner and a glorified escort mission because that's how they treated her. In reality, the AI partner is a part of the game just like the guns or the inventory system, and you'll have to learn how she plays just like those other features. If you leave her with a starting gun and stick her on cover mode, then she's going to be pretty much no help, and will not be able to drag you out of sticky situations you stumble into. There are 2 directives Sheva can be set to. If she's in cover mode, Sheva will stick to her handgun and stay close to you, and will heal you with whatever's available should you fall below a certain level of health. If you put her on attack mode, Sheva will venture outward a bit and use stronger weapons, will run around to collect gold and ammo from boxes unprompted, and won't render aid unless you call her back to do so. Yeah, probably not a good idea to do that around a Chainsaw Majini or Wesker, but those are 2 out of dozens of potential scenarios in which Sheva is extremely helpful if you allow her to be. What's more, the AI has contextual programming for nearly every situation in the game. If you allow her to carry the lantern in the mines while you do the shooting, she'll carefully follow your laser sight so you can always see. If you don't have a partner in the wetlands, she'll automatically pick up treasures for you if you drive the boat close enough. In the liquor sections, she'll walk slowly as long as you do the same, even if she's set to attack mode. Most noticeably, in the Wesker fight, Sheva will run off on her own to dispatch Jill, and will do so with pretty much no trouble without you having to watch her, running back to a hiding spot thereafter so she's not in the way while trying to shake off Wesker. If you want tips on how to better manage Sheva, then take advantage of the fact that one of the AI's finer points of programming is high accuracy, never missing her shots. You can mitigate the factors of sniper rifles this way that might otherwise scare you off. You might lose your situational awareness while looking through the scope and have difficulty aiming at a moving target, not to mention relocating said target if you miss with the S75, but Sheva won't have these problems. It also makes her a great lead in the Ouroboros Ahri fight, since she can track the cores very efficiently with the laser while you clear out the little tentacle blobs. All of these things, combined with the intense Mercenaries mode and the ability to switch to multiple filters or custom costumes, some of which are hilarious or jaw-droppingly sexy, makes Resident Evil 5 a great game with endless replayability, which is the main reason it's still played with great affection by the wider gaming community today. I say this with all feeling and purpose. Please play Resident Evil 5, especially if you're the type of person who finds themselves leaving negative comments about it. You are guaranteed to like something about this game, and I say that with a near desperate hope that people can one day get over this weird grudge against the game that has, if we're honest, impacted the direction Capcom has gone for the last 15 years. Because of all the things that I mentioned here, gamers in their endless toxicity and Resident Evil fans in their fervent fears of change have made it clear to Capcom that they don't forgive, which would end up influencing Resident Evil 6's overwhelmingly negative reception despite probably being the better game between the two, and doing a lot to try and make amends to those very fans. Resident Evil 4 may have lit a match, but Resident Evil 5 pressed it to a powder keg. I firmly believe that if Resident Evil 7 had come out between Resident Evils 5 and 6, then people wouldn't have been nearly so cruel to 6. I also believe that the fans who forced this latest direction from Capcom with the Ethan Winters arc and the endless remakes have done some damage to this series that they may not want to admit to. Here's the thing about Resident Evils 7 and 8. They are fantastic horror games, but in a lot of ways they simply aren't good Resident Evil games. While I like that Resident Evil returned to a horror focus, being a horror fan myself, I don't like that instead of going back to the drawing board, Resident Evil simply started copying Outlast's homework. Not to mention, the mold that Resident Evil has been forced into since those games emerged has made me fear getting a Resident Evil 5 remake as much as I desperately long for one. I say this because the Resident Evil 4 remake was, for me, way less enjoyable than the original. In all things, it basically serves as the diet version of Resident Evil 4 in a very direct way. Yeah, it's scary as hell. It's very much as terrifying as the original game. That much is preserved. However, everything else that was fun about Resident Evil 4 has been trimmed down or axed. Leon doesn't flirt with Hunnigan anymore, now it's all business professional. Krauser is wearing a shirt way more often. Like, who put this man in a shirt? Come on. And whichever one of you idiot developers took my gorgeous Asian sister out of the red and black butterfly cheapao she was wearing for no practical reason, it's on site. Can you imagine if they did that to Resident Evil 5? Made Ricardo way less yappy and dramatic, or toned down Shiva's tribal outfit? Or, God forbid, slimmed down Chris again? I think I'd go insane. And we shouldn't have to be in this position. I think it's time that Resident Evil fans learn to let go, and if they can't do that, then I hope that Capcom learns that some fans need to be told no, and to suck it up. Resident Evil has been in this era where it's endlessly catering to fans of the classics for about 8 years now, and it's ridiculous that, now that it comes time for fans of the actionized games to have their turn, they're holding out like they're afraid of stepping on toes. These games being successful wasn't a fluke, it was because they were way more well-liked than their detractors want to admit. And now that we've passed out of the era of Call of Duty dominance, maybe we can make a little room for one of the better Resident Evil games in our hearts.
More and more I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. For a future without fear? Yeah, it's worth it.